And you're getting put on my second monitor. So as Eric mentioned, this is going to be a packed presentation. And aside from being terrified of answering live questions on the spot, I don't know that we'll have a whole lot of time for Q&A, but I have this idea in my head that any questions that you do have, I will be able to better address and give you more thoughtful and thorough answers and responses by kind of following up after the presentation. So if you have questions, feel free. I encourage you to place them in the chat. If anyone wants to moderate the question and just is jumping out of their skin to ask something in front of the group, feel free to cut me off and chime in. And I will kind of like decide if I'll make an attempt to answer it on the spot or address it later. Does that sound all right with everyone? All right. So let's get this started. Welcome to part one of Bob Rossing with Auto Layout. When I first started at Driveway, I was terrified and constantly frustrated by auto layout. I just didn't understand it, and I pretty much refused to use it. I eventually became determined to figure it out, and I thought now would be a good time to share some of what I've learned along the way. Why Bob Ross? Bob Ross was a master of his tools. Bob didn't just wake up one morning painting perfect, happy little trees. It took practice. He learned how his tools worked and when to reach for the right brush. And I think a lot of that is applicable here with auto layout. Not only understanding how the various features work, but knowing when to reach and use each one. Now, I've come a long way since my early days of auto layout anxiety, and good thing so has the XD organization. We've definitely matured. When I first thought about putting this presentation together, auto layout wasn't being used as commonly as it is now. It used to be pretty rare to find auto layout examples in our design files at Driveway, unless you worked with Han. Nowadays, it's much more common. Now, prior to this, I did send out a survey, and the auto layout survey produced a small sample size, but I thought the results were encouraging. There were 11 individuals who answered the survey, and 7 of them, or about 64%, said that they're pretty confident with it, scaling down to 1 respondent saying that it scares them. 0 people said that they didn't use it at all. Now, if I were to just base this presentation purely on this, I probably I did consider trying to dive into like more advanced examples of auto layout right out of the gate. But after further consideration, I thought it was in everyone's best interest if I just started at the very beginning. I want to make this presentation for everyone. And because of that, I'm going to walk through the basic tools. And I think it's important that we all understand that each one of these features is powerful on its own, but the true art comes when you can master combining multiple techniques together. So even for the individuals out there who are pretty confident with it, I still hope that there may be some interesting nuggets buried in some of these humble beginnings. So let's get started and let's dive right into making our very first auto layout frame. All right, so I thought I would get started in this example with the ubiquitous to-do list example. We have 2 elements here on the canvas. We have a text input and a checkbox. And there's 2 ways in Figma that you can add auto layout. One is by pressing the addition sign that appears in the auto layout panel. And my preferred way is when 2 or more elements are selected is to hold down Shift and press A on your keyboard. You'll see that the panel updates on the right to give you the available auto layout controls or properties for that frame. So congratulations, we've just made our first auto layout frame. Equally as important to know how to create an auto layout frame is to remove one. And to do that, the best way that I can tell you how to do that is by clicking the subtraction icon that also appears in that same panel. So one thing I want to call out here is I'm going to go ahead and make that again, something I failed to mention. We're going to be looking at the layers panel a lot throughout this presentation. And the first thing that I want to mention now that we've created an auto layout frame is there's an icon to the left of the frame name. And the icon represents two rectangles that are stacked side by side. And we'll get into this later, but what this is indicating is the flow direction of the auto layout frame. When we remove the auto layout frame, you'll see that it defaults back to the default Figma frame icon. So I think that's an important note because what that means is that any auto layout frame is by nature a frame. And so anything that you can do with a frame, you can also do with an auto layout frame and so much more. All right, so a simple yet powerful addition to this is to create an auto layout composition. So you can imagine you might want to create an auto layout composition for a to-do list. And so focusing on the layers panel, I have gone ahead and created 4 auto layout frames containing to-do items. And I've selected them all, and I'm going to create a auto layout composition out of each of these. All right, so let's pay close attention to our layers panel. I'm going to go ahead and expand this and maybe name this, and we'll call it our to-do list. And a few things to call out here is that we now have 2 different icons that we can see in the layers panel. We have the auto layout composition icon, which has 2 rectangles stacked on top of each other, in addition to the to-do list item rectangles that are stacked side by side. Again, we'll address this, but this indicates the direction that content flows within the auto layout container. One last mention on this slide before moving on is that this kind of tripped me up and really boggled me at first. The auto layout reverses the order that seems natural or that you might think of the layers inside the auto layout composition. So you'll see here that I have this item selected. It says to do item, first item, and it is the last or the bottom item in the layers panel. So typically the layers, you might think would stack top to bottom. Figma has a very specific reason for doing this, and it's quite in depth. If anyone is really interested in learning about that, I will share a link or a resource out to that article in this presentation chat after the meeting. But just always be mindful that auto layout is going to reverse your orders in your layer panel from what you might think of as the natural stacking order. All right, so now it's time to dive into the auto layout controls. The auto layout controls are the icons or the options that you have available to you in the design panel on the right when you have an auto layout frame or auto layout composition selected. These controls are direction, spacing, padding, and there's also alignment and distribution, and we're going to go through each of them. So the most basic of these is direction. Pretty cool, but direction will allow you to enable the content within the auto layout frame to flow vertical, top to bottom, or horizontal, left to right. I can't tell you how many minutes and cumulative hours it would have taken to do something like that in Sketch or Photoshop in days before. And I think that that seems so natural and so intuitive now, but it's pretty cool if you ask me. All right, we're going to move on to spacing. I will select this auto layout composition, and I'm going to hover over the spacing control, and you'll see that the tooltip label this spacing between items, and that's really what it is. It allows you to control the spacing between items. You can use your cursor to adjust this. You can enter in a value manually, or you can use your arrow keys. And if you happen to have your nudge amount set to 8 pixels and you hold down the shift key, you're able to increase the spacing between value consistently with our spacing values that we use here at Driveway. It's important to note that this also works in both of the content flowing directions, so horizontal and vertical. That really comes in handy. All right, padding. This is probably one of my favorite aspects of auto layout, and you can do quite a lot with it. Actually, I think you can if you master it, I feel like you can actually start painting with padding. Developers do this, and so why not design with the same tools? Padding has two different ways of interacting with it. You can interact with global padding, which this pointer is indicating here, or there's individual padding available to you buried within this second control icon. So I'm going to go ahead and select the auto layout composition, and you can see that this element has 32 pixels of padding on all sides. To emphasize that a little bit, I'm going to open the Inspect tab and just kind of cursor around, and you can see very simply that there's 32 pixels, top, right, bottom, and left. Popping back into the individual padding, this is a newer feature in auto layout. This was released with version 3, which is what we have now to the best of my knowledge. And this really takes the padding controls to the next level because you can individually adjust padding for top, right, bottom, left in the same way that you can adjust a border radius top, right, bottom, left. This really comes in handy, and I think that if you're not already using this, and I know that many of you are, you can really get fine-grained control of your layouts and your interface components by being able to adjust these padding values individually. I think I particularly find this useful in like horizontal layouts when you might want just like a little bit more spacing on the left and right than you do on the top and bottom. That got a little weird. All right, layout controls. For this one, I'm going to step outside of the to-do list a little bit. I actually have the to-do list nested inside of a larger auto layout frame. So if we look at this, you'll see that I've got an auto layout frame here named example and a to-do list that's sitting inside of it. So I'm going to adjust the alignment on the outer container to demonstrate alignment. And I think that my key takeaway here is that we should be letting robots align things for us. They're a lot better at it and faster at it than we are. So let's let them do the work. Alignment is also located in this fourth icon in the auto layout panel. And you'll see there's a square in between the padding. And as I'm hovering my mouse over the different sort of quadrants of this square, you'll see I'm getting a representation of how the alignment controls will be updated within that auto layout frame. So you get alignment like top center, top right, center, center, left center, right center, etc. One thing to call out here is that all of these features sort of pair very well together and build on top of each other. So you'll also notice that my outer container has 72 pixels of padding on all sides. So when I align top center, it's respecting that 72 pixels of padding. I can remove the padding and you'll see that my top alignment goes directly to the edge of its container. All right, we've arrived at the fifth and last of the core auto layout controls. This one is distribution. This was literally the last feature that I discovered or like learned was there. I didn't know it was there for the longest time, and I think it's probably because it's a little hidden within the interface in Figma. There's a drop down that appears underneath the padding and alignment controls. And inside of this, you get packed and space between. I think it's important to mention that these properties behave in a very flexboxy type of way, which is a CSS, some CSS properties and controls that our developers are laying content out within a browser. And so it's very helpful to be able to lay things out or solve problems in similar ways as our developer teammates. Now, it's not like exactly the same as Flexbox, but I think that it's pretty close, and the Figma team did a pretty good job of kind of packaging it up in a very designer-friendly way. Okay, so let's look at what the two options are. Packed is this first example. I have 16 pixels configured to be the spacing between, so each of the avatars are 16 pixels apart. I'm now realizing that we need a new avatar for Melinda with her pink hair. And I'm going to expand this out, and you'll see that the elements inside of the auto layout container are staying packed. They're maintaining that 16 pixels. If I were to adjust the alignment on this, you'll see that that stays the same. The space between option is a little different. What space between does is it's going to use the available space in the container to calculate a consistent gap in between each one of your elements. So as I expand the outer container out, the children or the elements inside of the container are going to space out with it and maintain a proportional or percentage-based sort of gap in between them. And I think you can also get a good example of how this works when we start to add content. So Qian's going to join the space between party. And we've added an additional avatar. The space between each of the items has decreased, but it's creating consistent gaps in between each one of your elements, no matter how you adjust the content. And this does work horizontally and vertically as well. Now, I have one example for kind of a clever application for this. And I've got a few more that I'm hoping to include in part 2 of the presentation. But this is an example of how we can use the space between property to kind of create some overlapping content or some like kind of unique outcomes. So if I were to expand this out, it's using space between, and you'll see that as the frame gets larger, there's equal space in between these elements. But as the frame becomes smaller and is there's no longer any available space in between those items, it'll start overlapping. So you can kind of create some very cool layouts with this. Here's a face pile, which you can do the same thing with. And also these work horizontally and vertically as well, maintaining that same logic. All right, we're doing pretty good on time. So now we're going to dive into resizing. Suggestion, practice this, it's important. A couple of you have probably seen this example that I've shared before. I took this directly from the official Figma presentation on auto layout. I think it's a tremendous visual example of what the different properties do. So let's kind of dive into them. For one, we have fill container, we have hug contents, and fixed. Now, it took me quite a while to like fully grok what each one of these was, what it did. And it wasn't until I was like really able to play with this example that I felt like it really clicked with me. And so I have 3 examples of resizing and like nested auto layouts with resizing properties that I'm going to share out in a separate document after this presentation. And I would encourage anyone who is interested in learning more about this or is confused by this to practice with this. It really helped me. So I think that it might be worth it to check out. All right, so the first one is hug contents, and it's a super cute name. I love it, but what does it mean? It means that the container is going to always respect the content that is inside of it and hug it, no matter how big it gets. So this works horizontally and vertically. And the way that I think about this is kind of like a balloon. So a balloon will expand as big as possible. The more air that you blow in it. Hug contents is the same way. So if we were to get a little bit more specific with the example, I want to point out that this particular item has hug contents on the horizontal and on the vertical axis. Now, Figma does provide 2 different interfaces for interacting with resizing. There's a visual tool here on the left and some drop downs on the right. They do the exact same thing. I personally find this little visual grid quite confusing. It's just not as clear and concise to me as these drop downs. So I prefer and tend to use the drop downs. If anyone does use this and happens to know any cool secrets about it that this actually provides functionality that this doesn't, I would be curious to hear about that. All right, so hug contents, example time. I'm going to go ahead and type in here. So you'll see that as this is growing vertically, well, I'm typing out here horizontally, so it's growing horizontally. And as I make a line break or another line break or another line break, it continues to grow on both axes, so the container is hugging the contents. This next example has 2 properties set on it: fixed width horizontally and fill container vertically. So for this example, we're going to pay attention to what I'm going to call the parent container, which is this rectangle with the coral dashed line around it. So I'm going to adjust the width of the parent container, and we're going to watch how it affects these last 3 examples. So the purple box or rectangle is fixed width. So it's 185 pixels no matter, regardless of how big its parent container is. However, it is set to fill contents on the vertical or y-axis. So if we were to adjust the parent container, you'll see that its height is accommodating or adjusting to fill as much available space of its parent as possible. The next example is the inverse of that. So it's fixed height and fill horizontally. So as I adjust this width of the parent container, the fill horizontal property is allowing this element to flex or adjust in size to take up as much available space as possible, while its height is fixed. So as I change its height here, it maintains, and I think it's 241 pixels. It'll always be 241 pixels regardless of the size of its container. And this last example is fill container, fill container. So fill container horizontally, fill container vertically, and it is going to try to take up as much space as possible horizontally and vertically. A quick example of this doing its job: as we start to delete content, you'll see that it's continuing to consume more space because we've eliminated other elements, so there's more space for it to consume. And there you go. Fill contents horizontally and vertically. I feel like that was a very dense thing to try to present and communicate, and I don't expect anyone who's like new to this to um, fully understand that maybe right out of the gate. It definitely took me a while, but as I said, hopefully something that I can provide as a resource for individuals to dig into on their own. Now, just two examples that I'm going to touch on more quickly are the fact that these properties continue to cascade as you nest auto layout frames. So here we have a very similar example, but we now have a parent-child-grandchild relationship. So this yellow box is the child of the coral parent, and the blue rectangle here is the grandchild of the parent. I'm sorry, the grandchild, yeah, the grandchild of the parent. Now, these properties will cascade up to its closest parent or the thing that it's sitting inside. So for the example of this one, I'll just demonstrate real quick before moving on. This is set to fill container, fill container. If I were to set this to hug contents horizontally and hug contents horizontally and vertically, you'll see that it changes. And these properties are based off of the available space of its outer container. So another example that we will hopefully continue to revisit in part 2 of this presentation, and something for everyone to dig into on their own. And just wanted to call out here that, again, you can go pretty wild with this. You can find yourself in a Russian doll nesting situation where you've got, great grandchildren, and you can, pretty much continue this on and on and on and on. However, this is really powerful, and I don't want to discourage people from doing this because, as you can kind of see here, once you start to increase the level of nesting that you have within your auto layout frames, you can start to see how you can kind of have a little bit of responsive control of your layouts as you start to think about how you're going to adjust your designs across multiple screen sizes. So this example is here. But one thing I do want to mention is that paying attention to the layers in your panel, in the layers panel, is really important here. Understanding your layers, naming your layers, etc., is going to make everyone's life easier, not only while you're learning this, but for other designers who are coming in and needing to interact with your work. All right. I wanted to just share a few responses from the survey real quick. This question that these answers are responding to is, what is your biggest frustration in auto layout? And this participant answered, creating more and more auto layout layers to solve for something, and then needing to click down a ton to edit or design. All in all, I feel more confident creating something clean when I know the final solution, but can get really messy with a million auto layer groups when I'm working in progress. Similarly, when I have a lot of nested auto layout frames and they get disorganized, designing at scale, the more layers, the harder it is for me to get right. So I'm going to touch on these, I believe, in the next slide a little bit, but I want to keep this in mind. Responding to this designer here and then needing to click down a ton to edit a design. One thing that I just wanted to remind everyone is that, yes, when you have nested content, one way of getting to the things that you need is the infamous double clicking until you arrive, but you can also command click and directly select something regardless of how nested it is. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is in more heavily nested layers, you can also, if you're paying attention to your layer panel, just directly click on the thing that you want, and it will be able to give you the control. So something to just to be mindful of, because that can be a little infuriating for me. I definitely feel that pain. All right. So to hark on this a little bit, this example that I have on screen, this helps no one. Frame, 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 frame. Confused by nested auto layout frames? This might be one of the reasons why. In my opinion, this communicates very little. I promise you that this level of nesting is probably not necessary and is most likely a byproduct of adding auto layout without paying close attention to what's going on in the layer panel. And just wanted to call out that it's cumbersome to navigate and it increases complexity for yourself, other designers, possibly engineers who are interacting with handoff files, etc. So I'm gonna hammer on the name game. Naming your frames can help you in so many different ways. While you're learning, communicating to other designers, other designers coming in to pick up your work, saving yourself some future time, and also just making auto layout a little easier to understand. So I want to give a shout out to the inventory team and the admin scale team. I see a lot of really good examples in your files of properly naming auto layout frames. I've popped into a few of your files recently, and this is an example here from a cell flow. And you can see here that there is a very clear naming strategy going on here. We've got the auto layout frame, which is named screen. We have a footer. We have the body. Inside the body, we have call to actions, forms, page title, cell, stepper, mobile. Like, that's really easy and clear to understand. One final comment on this is that I understand if you are thinking, I'm not naming my layers. They're like, that's a waste of time, or it takes a lot of time, and my plate is already so full. And I just wanted to maybe provide commentary that our developer counterparts are required to name the containers that they put content into, and would end up being a pretty horrible experience for the web in general if everything that they put content into is just a div. So I don't know if I have the right way of saying that quite yet, but yeah, let's name our layers. Cool. So let's get into some examples of painting with auto layout and put some of these tools to use. Most of these are going to be a little shorter, like examples and tips and tricks. But before I do that, just wanted to share another Figma example that when I saw this, it kind of blew my mind. So one thing that I haven't demonstrated yet is some of the flexibility of being able to manipulate content within auto layout. So here's a table, and I have one of the rows selected. And because of the auto layout properties, I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard to move content around. I could go ahead and create or select two of these table rows and duplicate them. And you'll see that my auto layout is adjusting accordingly. And what really blew my mind when I saw this for the first time is that these are each rows, right? So you can see the blue bounding box that groups each one of these. And sure, I can move these up and down, and that's pretty neat. But you can also grab individual cells inside an auto layout thing and shift those throughout your auto layout as well. And so just wanted to demonstrate some of the flexibility there. I personally think that's pretty cool. All right, so let's look at spacing and vertical rhythm examples, and how we can use auto layout to create some easier and more consistent spacing control. So one thing that I want to just mention is that we do have an inspect panel in Figma. And while this is kind of like the default view for individuals who don't have write or edit access, that the inspect tool is for designers too. Also, you can use this to come in and inspect your own designs. teammates' designs to evaluate things as you're trying to like polish or put some finishing touches on things. Here I'm giving some examples of how I'm inspecting padding, but I can also select an element here and start to look at spacing in between elements. So if I were to come up here and select this title block, I can see that there's 16 pixels of padding. And where this really comes in handy is as we're kind of like polishing and evaluating our layouts to help us enforce consistency. So here I can see that there's 16 pixels between the title and subtitle, but in this example down here, there's only 4. And in this example down here, there's 20. So in some of my previous walkthroughs, I had taken the time to kind of go through this example and fix this whole composition to try to make it much more consistent. And I've decided that I don't know that I'm going to do that, but I may just like use one example here to show how we can adjust spacing. So let's look at our layer panel and see what we have going on in this first example. We have a card and there's 2 things inside of it. And notice when I hover over or click on the layers or the auto layout frames inside, I get a little indication of what it is. So let's click on the card header and just adjust our spacing value to be, let's make it 4. Let's make it 0. And then we'll come back out and I see that I have 2 things here. I've got card content and card header. So in order to adjust the spacing between those 2 things, I'm going to look to the parent. Those are currently 8. Maybe I want those to be 24. And inside of card contents, I see that I've got a bullet list and buttons. And I want to increase the space of those 2 things. So I have the card content container selected, and let's increase that 32, and let's give it a little bit more space, 48. I like 32 better. So what I wanted to try to demonstrate there is not like, yes, this design is much improved or it's perfect, it's not. But it's really quick and easy to be able to manipulate spacing values by manipulating numbers in the panel as opposed to trying to use your mouse to be very precise and click and drag things around on the screen. So by combining the inspect panel and the core auto layout features, we can really make sure that our vertical rhythm and spacing is consistent and fine-tuned. Got 20 minutes left and I'm feeling really confident that we're gonna get through this ahead of time. All right, so one thing that I wanted to mention here that I do see some opportunities for improvement in terms of like improving the quality of life for designers within the organization is to try to auto layout the most parent frame as possible. Let the parent do as much work as possible. So what do I mean by this? Let's say that we have a small screen layout, and in looking at this layout, I can see that some of these spacing values are a little different, like the gutters here on the side. I don't know if this is the, oh, I'm sorry. I jumped ahead and I'm talking about the wrong example. Okay. What I am trying to demonstrate here is this example on the left is not auto layout. It's a frame. And this is how, when I first started, I typically used to work. Let's say I wanted to add a footer. I would try to like insert this into the layout somehow. Okay, it's at the bottom. It's not quite where I want it, but it's getting cut off. So now I have to increase the height of the frame. Oh, the frame's already, oh man, this is a mess. What am I doing? Okay, there we go. And that's pretty tedious. Anytime I wanted to add more content to this small screen layout, I would have to, go back and adjust the height of my frame. Nobody has time for that, and it's frustrating. So with auto layout, as we've seen in some of the previous examples, you can put auto layout on your frame, like the outermost thing that is wrapping your designs. And because of that, you can easily add content to it. And the frame is going to adjust it accordingly. You never have to adjust the height of a frame ever again. Not only is that a huge time saver, but it's ultimately pretty convenient and super fun. Now, I pulled out this comment from the survey, and I think if I remember correctly, there was something in here I wanted to touch on. So this is in response to, what are you most interested in learning about auto layout? Designing dense layouts, designing faster, and talking about when to use it and when not to use it in the concepting phase. That phase is tricky because you can sometimes hold your innovation back. And I totally understand that, but I did want to use this as an example of mentioning that just because you have auto layout on anything or on your most parent frame, that does not mean that everything that lives inside of your auto layout frame also needs to be auto layout. So over here, I have two examples of non-auto layout frames, and we'll drag a header in here and this little section down here. And for this, I can like grab specific elements in here. Let's grab this group. You can kind of see that I can move things around. Because this is not auto layout, I can, in the example down here, I can select something and change the size and position of things. So I can still be loose and innovative within the greater context of an auto layout container. So just wanted to call that out because I thought that that was a worthwhile mention. Similarly, another opportunity for increasing some efficiency with auto layout is to set padding on the most parent frame possible. Moving as much control to your parent container also has benefits beyond auto layout, but in this example, let's take a look at how the content is aligning with these outer gutters. So I can see that this is looking, let's see, it's, I don't know, is it 16 or 24? This has 16 pixels of padding left and right, which is looking pretty good. This looks like it has about 8, and this is a lot more. So let's say this was the design that you were working on, and you either noticed the inconsistency yourself, you got some feedback that it needed to be adjusted. You would have to go into each one of these auto layout frames and then adjust the padding accordingly. So I'll do that here. And then I'd have to come down here and do that on this frame as well. You can imagine as your screens get more complex, the more places that you need to go in and make edits. Something to consider is to try to shift the responsibility of padding to the outermost frame possible. So here in this example, I have moved padding to the body, and I can control padding everywhere for each one of the sections by manipulating the padding on the parent container, which contains all of the other elements, instead of each individual section. So that allows you to make adjustments a lot more consistently and rapidly as you're modifying things. This comes in handy when you're starting to adjust your screens for different breakpoints at different screen sizes as well. I think I mentioned that this whole sort of mantra of shifting as much control or responsibility to the most parent frame as possible, having other implications or benefits outside of auto layout as well. This is totally true. Another example that I see a lot is clipping. So Figma has a feature called clipping, and this is another example of if you were to move the responsibility of clipping to the most parent frame, you'll find that it would be a lot more, there's a lot of gained efficiencies by doing this as opposed to going in and adding clipping to each one of the sections. So that's just another example of like shifting parental control. All right. This next one is on auto layouts and grids. So we see Tyler Davis. For anyone who attended, I think it was last week's all hands presentation, Tyler gave a very amazing and very thorough walkthrough presentation on our grid system here at Driveway, how we can use it, why we can use it, when to break it, all the things about grids. And it inspired me to include a quick section on how we can use some of what we've learned today to make aligning to our grids at Driveway a little bit easier. So here is an example on the left where things are not quite hitting that. Oh, let's turn our grids on. I'm going to hold down Control G and let's take a look at what we have going on. So in this example here, I can see that content is kind of bleeding outside of the grid into the outer gutter. Our margins in between content is not quite consistent with our grid system, etc. So how can we use auto layout to make our lives easier when designing on a grid? So we'll use a few of the techniques that we've looked at so far. The first one is padding. So I can easily make sure I'm hitting our outer grid lines by manipulating padding controls. So here in this grid, there are 24 pixels of padding on the outer left and outer right. So I can make sure that I'm setting 24 pixels so our content is filling that space. This first example here is set to fill container, so it's filling the available space. This second example here is using the space between value, which is 16 pixels, to make sure that the content here, which is the margin in between our grid lines, is even with 16 pixels. And if we were to take a quicker look at, or a closer look at this, let's look at these two elements in here. So let's say we wanted to modify this. This element here has a fixed width, and this element here is set to fill container. So if I were to adjust my fixed width element to line up with this grid line, you'll see that I still get our perfect 16 pixels of spacing in between, and the fill container element, because it's doing what fill container does and trying to consume as much possible space as it has, we get a well-aligned composition that hits our grid lines. And this bottom example down here is just kind of an example of how we can use some of our resizing properties like fill container to allow content to kind of flow and fall within our grid, as long as we're using like padding, space between, and our resizing properties to enable us to do so. This one may not have, we have like two more things to go through. I may skip the last one or just do a quick demonstration of it. But let's see if I can speed through this. So one thing that I have personally found that can be tedious sometimes in auto layouts is working with dividers or horizontal rules. Our dividers are, oftentimes 1 pixel or 2 pixels. They can be a little finicky to make sure that you're being precise and accurately grabbing them with your cursor. And as you add new content in an auto layout frame, you have to like go in and then like duplicate additional divs or dividers. So this example here is going to show one way that you might be able to create dividing lines, full width dividers between content without actually adding physical borders or horizontal rules. So I'm going to click in here and we have a card stack. Looks like there are 1, 2, 3, 4 cards in here. And the background color is set to secondary 100. So you can't see the background right now because it's being hidden by these cards. But if I were to adjust the space between value here to say 4 pixels, you'll see that I now get the visual effect of having horizontal rules or dividers between content for free. And as I add cards, we get those gaps. If our design system ever changed a spacing value from 4 to 8, we can easily update that in one place, and it automatically updates all of the gaps or borders in between those sections, which is pretty cool. And you can achieve similar layouts. This is not quite a border, but by manipulating padding, so we'll make this 24, and space between, we'll make this 16. We can kind of easily create like list style or like stacking card interfaces just by manipulating 2 values. All right. And the last one is I'm hoping to be a little bit of a teaser because I'm hoping to touch on this in the second part of this. But that's kind of how to use auto layout to make our lives as designers a little easier or a little bit more efficient when thinking about designing screens responsively, creating multiple screen sizes for handoff, etc. So all of these screens here were built off of this single 320 example. And because of time and because I'm also a little tired of talking, I'm going to maybe just give a quick example of how to scale out one screen starting from 320 to our different breakpoints. So what I might think about doing is duplicating this. I held down on my keyboard, it's Option, drag, and I'm going to, you'll see first of all that I have some resizing properties set up, so things are a little stretchy. And let's go ahead and make this 375. You know what, that's looking pretty good. I don't think that I need to make any design decisions at 375 that are different than at 320. Let's drag this out again and make it 420. That's looking pretty good, but you know what? I think that we have a little bit more screen real estate, so why don't we make this top section consume a little bit more vertical space. We can do that with this one too. Let's make our tablet view. So we'll set this to 768. Okay. You know what? That's going to probably feel a little awkward. Things are getting a little wide. Let's see if we can't adjust some of our content here a little bit. So I'm going to first look at this bottom section, and I see that I have some nested frames going on here. I've got top and bottom, and they're flowing vertically. So let's go ahead and set this to horizontal. Oh, okay. That's looking a little funny. What do I do now? Let's use some of our resizing properties to make some adjustments here. And we'll have each one of these sections set to fill container. So they take up a more appropriate amount of space. And that's looking pretty good. We might want to maybe adjust the space between value to give it a little bit more breathing room. We might want to, do the same thing up here. So this isn't like a perfect example, but trying to demonstrate how we can kind of lean on all of these techniques here to more rapidly adjust things as our screen sizes increase and make our lives doing multiple screen sizes and handoff files a little bit easier. So that concludes the end of the presentation. Part 2 to be continued soon. Let's do this again sometimes. I'm hoping that next time will maybe be a little bit more slower pace because I'd like to dive into some actual layouts that we work with on a day-to-day basis here at Driveway and kind of show how we can kind of flex on some of these and build upon some of these fundamentals that we looked at today. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. Have I stopped screen sharing? Okay. Thank you so much for letting me talk nonstop for 57 minutes. That was very awkward for me. I hope you all learned something. I'm going to dig through comments. I can't wait to see what questions people have, and I am going to dig into those and make sure that I can help anyone who has questions or wants to talk more. I might set up an office hours too as a follow-up.
Thank you so much, Derek. I think it's safe to speak for everybody when I say this is absolutely amazing, totally enlightening. And thank you so much for walking us through this, and can't wait for round two. Just a heads up, next week we're going to have David walking through some of the changes and evolution of the content org. So make sure to show up for that. And if anybody, after that, I think that we have some openings. So if anybody has been digging into any interesting topics, feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to share with the group. We'd love to hear what y'all have been learning. And with that, I think unless anybody has anything else to say, we can break and have a great weekend if we don't talk to you before then.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Derek.